Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our April talk. And you may recall that those of you who were here last month, that at the end of the talk we mentioned that the person we had lined up wasn't available. And so we'd let you know in due course who it was. Well, we've been most fortunate because we have Carol Fuller. And Carol, quite happily really, didn't really mind the arm twist too much, decided that she could look at her life and her work. And it just so happened, of course, we'd had her as one of our potential speakers, that she was named Launceston Citizen of the Year last year. So works out really well because I don't think there's another one yet. So you're still it, aren't you, Carol? So that's great. I've worked with Carol and I know what she's capable of, but I didn't realise she came out as a 10-pound pom, and we all know people who did, of course, and what a contribution they've made. But Carol has called her talk The Life and Times of a 10-Pound Pom, and she asks the question eventually, was she worth the money? Well, I'll leave that up to you. You can decide and tell her at the end. I won't go into details of Carol's career because she'll be covering that, and I don't want to steal any thunder, but I would like to point out a couple of things. Firstly, Carol is, she probably won't say this, but the most amazing cook, and I've been fortunate enough to enjoy some of those efforts. She is a formidable organiser, and you suddenly find yourself doing things you had no intention of doing, and she runs wonderful teams. She's also an amazing jigsaw. Is that a word? Jigsawer? Addict. I am too, but on a far lesser scale. Carol will look at a jigsaw and think, nah, too easy. She goes for the really, really challenging ones. And I think this is a pretty good metaphor, really, for Carol's life. She sees the big picture. She looks at it very carefully. She breaks it down into its varying shapes and colours, and then she proceeds with great dedication, patience, above all, skill, never ever gives up. And I mean, you should see these jigsaws. They are amazing, like all one colour type of thing. And at the end, she celebrates the achievement, which I think is fantastic, by having them framed, but only the really, really challenging ones. And she's proud of what she does, and I think that's fantastic. And also assisting Carol in her jigsawing was her dad. And her dad made her this most amazing easel, and with little component parts attached where you could put your colours. And I think that really sort of sums up how I look at Carol's life. She's done wonderful things and she's had some support along the way, particularly a very, very devoted family. And I'll now let her tell you all about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. I don't need to say anything more. Can I first acknowledge the Indigenous custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Now, the title of this talk is a misnomer. I wasn't a 10-pound pom. I have all the correspondence here that my mum and dad went into when they applied to migrate to Australia. and it says quite clearly, please forward the sum of £22 made up of £20 passage contribution and £2 landing money. The £10 was for Mum and Dad. My brother and I were actually freebies. We were under 14, so it cost us nothing. And surprisingly, the £2 of the £22 was returned to Mum and Dad when they arrived in Melbourne. So, why did my parents decide to emigrate to Australia? It's at this point where you realise how little you know about your parents. You don't ask these questions, you just go along with it. I was only 7 when all this occurred, so I wasn't consulted about whether I wanted to go to a foreign country. I can only remember my mother being worried that there might be Tasmanian tigers roaming the streets at night. And she didn't like the idea of snakes. That's all I remember about the talk before we actually got on the boat and sailed. So I can only speculate about why they did this. My paternal grandmother was Canadian, and I believe at one stage the Canadian branch of the family offered to sponsor Mum and Dad and Jeffrey and I to Canada. Don't know why Mum and Dad chose Australia, but I'm glad they did, although having been to Canada, it would have been quite a different but interesting life there too. So, speculation. To do this, I need to examine my parents' life. This is my mother. You can tell by all the names that she was born into a Catholic family, but she was born on the wrong side of the blanket. The family was a mining family in the north of England, Newcastle on Tyne. So my mother was a Geordie. She didn't have a good childhood. She was passed from one relative to another, and at 14 she was sent into service in Yorkshire, looking after other people's children and doing other people's housework. At the beginning of the war, she was working in a munitions factory, as a lot of women did, taking over the men's jobs. And she rose to be a supervisor at that munitions factory, so I think she must have had some skills and capabilities. And I think about her life as a nanny and a houseworker, and I'm thinking she must have been really bored. She married Jeffrey Jennings Sr. During the war, and they had my brother, Jeffrey Jennings Jr. When Jeffrey was 6 months old, his father had never met him. His father was in the Coldstream Guards and fighting in France on the Belgium-French border. But the army allowed him to come home because my brother was so very ill. He spent a week with my mother and my brother, went back into the war zone and was killed in the Market Garden operation, a failed Montgomery operation in 1944. My mother, being Catholic, although I don't think she was necessarily a practicing Catholic, was visited by the local Catholic priest, who proceeded to tell her that she must have been really bad to have God punish her so badly. So I think my mum was probably really pleased to turn her back on her life in the UK and find something new. Enter her younger brother-in-law, Norman Jennings, my father. So my mother married two brothers, not at the same time. My father was one of those men who could fix or build and invent anything. There wasn't anything that he couldn't do. And I still sometimes, when something goes wrong, reach for the phone to talk to him. He joined the Royal Navy when he was 18 as a motor mechanic and rose to be a chief petty officer. He worked on landing craft and minesweepers in the Mediterranean. Towards the end of the war, and very few people know this, there was an outbreak of smallpox amongst the Allied forces. And my dad was one of those servicemen who contracted smallpox. He was evacuated to North Africa, where he was nursed by the Queen Alexandra Nursing Corps, and luckily for me, he survived, because I hadn't been born yet. Towards the end of the war, 1946, he was part of the crew that sailed the American landing craft back to New York. So this is what I speculate about my dad and migration. He'd been in the Mediterranean. He'd been in North Africa. He'd visited New York. He'd seen the world outside of the small Yorkshire village on the edge of the Ilkley Moor where he had been born and grew up. I think he developed a wanderlust and also an appreciation that there was a big wide world out there that he could take part in. By the time I was born, he had a ready-made family with my brother. I call him my brother. He's my cousin and he's my stepbrother, but we've never really made any distinction with the step thing. I think Dad saw that there were more opportunities outside of the UK. I can remember that we were still using ration books. That was when I was 7, so this was, 54. 53, 54, and UK was still recovering from the war. So Dad, I think, wanted better opportunities for me and my brother. Australia bound. Dad was a skilled tradesman and he had 2 young children. We were an ideal candidate for migration to Australia, who wanted to populate and have more skilled people. In 1954, they applied to emigrate, and by November 55, we'd set sail. It didn't take long, and in the meantime, Dad was first given a position in Queensland, but he had a hernia and decided that he'd stay in England, have the operation on the National Health, and then we could go. In the meantime, he was given a sponsorship by City Motors. I think City Motors here in Australia is now Motors, and he was told that he could have a position in Hobart. Like good parents who wanted to show their children the world, we visited London first. Dad had to do a training course in Dagenham, which is the big motor company complex in the south of England. And from the correspondence that I've got here, I haven't got Dad's letters, but I've got what Australia House and Tasmania House sent to him. One of them says that he has to sit an exam And I should imagine that absolutely scared Dad. Dad was a great reader, a great listener, a huge debater. He would deliberately take the opposite tack just to get a discussion going. But he considered himself only semi-literate when it came to putting pen to paper. Actually writing all this stuff and going through the process must have been really hard for him. And I realise now how brave both of them were to undertake this migration. So, November 55, the SS New Australia, which was a converted troop carrier, no luxury liner, we set off from Southampton. My brother and I were both seasick the first day. We hadn't even left the wharf. I spent quite a bit of the voyage in the ship's hospital. There were a lot of children on board, and school sores was raging in Potago. Mum and Dad, being community-minded people, said I had to go into isolation in the hospital. They fed me mashed potatoes and boiled mince every meal. It still makes me feel nauseous. I can't eat mashed potatoes at all. Apart from that, my school teacher had given me a Conway Stewart fountain pen as a going away present, and it disappeared while I was in hospital, which I'm really sad about that. While we were on a route to Melbourne, Dad got a message to say that we weren't going to Hobart at all, we were going to Smithton. They knew nothing about Smithton. So we arrived in Melbourne, got off the ship, practically walked across the tarmac and got on a plane and flew to Wynyard, which was quite an exciting thing for us. I mean, Jeffrey and I, being on a boat and then on a plane, this was great. But we were quickly brought down to earth when we got into the cart in Wynyard to go to Smithton because the road was a gravel road. It wasn't even sealed. This was in 55. So, Mum and Dad arrived in Smithton. They had another £10 in their pocket. They had one trunk that had all our clothes in it. That trunk's at the bottom of my bed and has all my linen in it now. And 4 tea chests. One of them had Axminster carpet in it. Have no idea why Mum felt that that was really important. But there was also a willow pattern dinner service. And I can remember it arriving before we left, and my brother and I dipping into it, and it had real wood shavings in it. It was like a lucky dip and bringing out all this. I've got one of those plates left. It's up on the wall above my bed. So Smithton, yep. Almost going from one small village to another. We were European, we spoke English, so we didn't have any troubles being accepted. You know, we looked like everybody else, except when we opened our mouths. Broad Yorkshire accents, and I can't imitate it anymore, but I know that I was teased all the time. Kids at school would say to me, "What do you call a baby dog?" "A puppy dog." Children are. We had 2 other families follow us, coming out with City Motors. So we had like a little enclave of UK people, but Mum and Dad made Australian friends because Dad, working in the motor trade, had lots of customers. He went out to farms and things like that, so he made friends very easily. It was City Motors back then was a very family orientated business, and we had Christmas parties. the funny thing about this Christmas party here, with this little boy who's so scared of Santa Claus was his dad. But we had a lot of fun there. Apart from the weather being so much better than the UK, we used to spend days at Lavender Beach, which is now where Port Latter is, and probably really spoiled. But back then it was just pristine beach. And the beaches around the Nut at Stanley. Lots of family barbecues and with friends. That was a great 3 years. But as I said, it was as though Dad had gone from one small village to another one. And so I think he wanted to get more into the mainstream. And we moved to Somerset. Was it the right move? Despite poisoned arms and legs from mosquito bites, unsealed roads, the wharfies strike when we arrived in Smithton that went on for 3 weeks. We arrived at the beginning of December, just before Christmas. There was a 3-week wharfies strike, so all our clothes, all our possessions were caught up in Melbourne. The accommodation that the City Motors was providing wasn't available because the manager was in the flat that we were going to go in, and he was building a house on Tier Hill and it wasn't finished. So we ended up 3 weeks at the Bridge Hotel in Smithton, and our rooms were above the public bar, which was called the Snake Pit. Mum didn't know what to do with Jeff and I, so she borrowed some clothes from the publican's wife and sent us to school. Yeah, we just went straight into school for the last 3 weeks of the year. I think that and Dad's desire to get more into the mainstream meant that we moved to Somerset. In 1958, he was the proprietor of the BP Somerset service station. They were able to buy a house, and in another 10 years' time, Jeffrey and I were both university graduates with careers. So I think probably it was the right move. Okay, me. What did I do? Somerset Primary School, I shared top marks each year with a boy called Paul Vlagsma. He was a Dutch migrant. He ended up a professor of mathematics at ANU. I didn't quite reach that level, although I did get to lecture at uni, yeah. I don't remember very much about my primary school, except that I just loved school, and that's probably why I ended up becoming a teacher. I loved learning, I loved doing things and seeing the world, especially history and especially English. I played a lot of sport at school. Softball, netball, athletics, and won trophies. I can remember being called a noxious weed because I hit a home run at softball. So the tall poppy syndrome was quite well established at Burnie High School. I did well academically, except when I went home and told Dad that I'd got 99% for Latin in one of my exams. The inevitable response, what happened to the other 1%? Perhaps that's why I became such a determined achiever. In what, year 8, D class, that's when your parents choose the course that you're going to take. Mum and Dad chose a commercial course for me, shorthand typing, but my Latin teacher, Cecilia Stubbs, said, this girl has to go on to university. She'll do 3 languages. So I ended up doing French, Latin, German, and English. right through to matric. I don't know why my school teachers had so much influence about the course that I followed, except that Mum and Dad were working so hard. They arrived with £10, they had achieved so much, but they had to really work full-time, weekends and all, especially in the service station. And that was the time when service stations were rostered to be open, so that there was petrol available all the time. So I guess my teachers had a really big influence on my course in life, perhaps at this stage in my education more than my parents. I matriculated with credits in year 11. Couldn't see any point in going back and doing a whole lot more subjects, so opted to go straight on to university. There was another reason. I started going out with Keith Fuller when I was in grade 9. We'd gone through high school together. He was a year ahead of me. He went off to uni. Guess where I wanted to be? Naive idiot. So, after 1 year of matriculation, just turned 17 at the end of my matriculation year, I went off to university with an Education Department scholarship, and Jeffrey got an Education Department scholarship too. Burnie High School seemed to channel its academic people into the teaching profession. And let's face it, Mum and Dad could not have afforded to send me to university or Jeffrey to university. We had to get a scholarship to get there. Oh, we've jumped. I was too young, too naive, too unprepared for uni. I passed, I worked hard and I passed, but I didn't use all the opportunities that I could have. I didn't get involved in university life. And to some extent I regret that now. An indication of how backward I was socially, in my first year I boarded with a doctor and his family in Lipscomb Avenue in Sandy Bay. And Dr Finlay in that year was a Labor candidate, which is a bit strange, a Labor candidate for the federal election. And I came home from uni one day and there was this very tall, imposing man warming his bottom in front of the fire. And I just said hello and sort of whizzed through to my room. It wasn't until I got into my room that I realised it was Gough Whitlam. And I had lost my chance to actually talk to him. But that's an indication of how young I was and how, how opportunity slipped through my fingers. At the end of uni, Keith was conscripted. We got married because he'd been conscripted. This was the Vietnam War. And he was allowed to teach for 1 year. We were both posted to Devonport High School. So I'm on the next slide. I taught ancient history and English and social science, and I had a class in every year. My ancient history students, I realised, were only 3 years younger than I was. I was just turned 21. Here I was teaching them and they were almost my own age. They were almost my peers. I was so young that I could coach and play in the senior girls' netball team at school, which was fun. You all right? And we were there for 2 years. My sister-in-law also taught at Devonport High School. My brother was at Reese High School. Keith then saw a notice up on the board with that Bernard Shaw quote, "Those who can do, those who can't teach," and then those who can't teach, teach teachers. Well, Keith said he wasn't going to put up with this and he applied for a job with Kodak in Melbourne. So we took off to Melbourne. He became, an estimator. I had to find a job and I got one at a Catholic boys' college, Whitefriars College. I was the only female on the campus. I had classes of grade 7, grade 8, grade 9 boys with 40 in each class. That is where I learnt to teach. I designed a 3-level work program with extension work to keep, because they weren't streamed, so I had, a full range of academic abilities in the class of 40. I really enjoyed that. I let the boys make films. It was the beginning of educational exploration. It wasn't just chalk and talk. However, Keith said we'd come this far, so we may as well keep going, and he applied for an international transfer to London with Kodak. We arrived in London in the early 70s. He had a job, I didn't. I walked into an employment bureau called Brook Street Bureau, looking for a job, and they said, come and work here. So I started as a employment broker. This was in the time in England where race laws had just come into being. And young Indian and Pakistani women would come in with a male relative. They weren't allowed to come in by themselves, looking for a job. How could they do that? I would find a filing clerk job and ring up, and as soon as I said the name, Patel, that vacancy's filled. And I just found that really soul-destroying, not only for the young women, but that racial prejudice was so strong. I couldn't do that. They offered me my own. I guess they didn't usually have university graduates walking in off the street to get jobs. I then moved to the Electricity Council. I was assistant to the personnel manager, and I was responsible for placing all the advertisements for vacancies in newspaper and preparing all the interview panels. Well, Jill said I was an organiser. Yeah, I got that office reorganised so fast that I could go out for lunch and not bother going back to work afterwards. I learnt so much in that year or two about organisation and administration. And although I was a teacher at heart, that was invaluable in my later career. That was the time when we went to the Munich Olympics. We were there when the Israeli athletes were killed. That was a really profound experience, sitting in the Olympic Stadium with hundreds of people not knowing whether the Games was going to continue or not. When we went to the airport to leave Munich, police and army with submachine guns all over the place. That was not a good experience. Keith got sick of being in business, and he applied for a teaching job at Guernsey Grammar School, Guernsey being one of the small islands off the coast of UK. He was offered the job, and we thought we'd come to England so we could travel and see Europe and go off everything. So he turned that down. But there must have been an old boys network in the grammar schools in England, because he got a letter from Bedale School offering him a job there, which he decided to take. Bedales, although the building looks very traditional and old, Bedales was a very progressive school. It was a top-tier public school. Very privileged celebrities' children go to this school. The students called teachers by their Christian names, and there was no school uniform. I taught Lawrence Olivia's son Richard. He was in my class. Keith taught Princess Margaret's children. And I walked into the school foyer one morning and there was this very imposing person, a black fedora, a black coat that went down to the ground and black boots. It was Rod Steiger. That was the sort of school it was. Financially and materially very privileged children, but some of them were emotionally underprivileged. I spent a term there filling in for somebody who'd gone on leave, and after that I was appointed to Petersfield County Secondary School, which is sort of the other end of the spectrum completely educationally. It was a time of ROSLA. ROSLA stands for the Raising of the School Leaving Age in England, so that there were classes of 15, 16-year-olds who really only wanted to go out and work, but they had to go to school. I had one of those classes. There was no curriculum because it was so new. They wanted to be employed, so I taught them how to write job applications, do job interviews, apply for council flats, budget, all those sorts of things. And I think that's where I started really being interested in life skills, being very aware that when I was at school, I got no life skills except what I got from my parents, who were very busy. And I thought, you know, kids need to know these things. They need to be taught these things. The other interesting class that I had was remedial religious knowledge. I don't know why it was remedial, but the worst thing about that was that the room that we were timetabled in was the staff lunchroom. And so halfway through the lesson, we had to vacate the classroom and go into the change room to... I was not impressed with the Hampshire education system at all. There was also a teacher who taught in the same room as me after my class, and he couldn't control his class, so he'd go in at recess time and fill the board with notes, and that's how he kept his class occupied, copying down from the board. The only thing is, when I was teaching, I didn't have a blackboard because it was covered with his notes. So I decided it was time for me to come home to Australia, which I did. I was appointed to Brooks High School. By this time, Keith had decided that he really liked teaching United Nations diplomats' kids and Princess Margaret's kids, and so he decided to stay in England. And he was always more English. He was born in England, but he was more English than I ever was. I'd become a real Australian. I went to Brooks High School and under the auspices of Denzel Williams set up what we called the mini school, which was 25 children from each grade, 7 to 10, with 4 other teachers, so that we could really get to know these children. It was a bit like, it was a high school, but it had some of the philosophies of a primary school. This is where I first realised that I was female. I'd organised an excursion with my grade 8 class, and on the day the senior male teacher was sick and wasn't able to come with us. And so I was told we couldn't have the excursion, and I said, I've organised it, you know, I will take it. And I was told, no, you can't. You're a woman, and besides, you look too young. I don't think I even had a response to that, but I did take the excursion. After Brooks, I got my first promotion to Ravenswood High School with Peter Brooker, who, again, was one of those progressive educationalists. And I think this is all sort of coming into what I believe with my teaching. He believed in really finding out about the children, getting to know them, liking them, and lots of pastoral care. It was very embarrassing. The first week of my new appointment at Brooks High School, I had to ask for accouchement leave. Bryce Ward, who was then the superintendent, told me that he wished it was the time when he could sack me because I was pregnant. I'd like to see him say that to somebody now. I had to take 12 weeks leave before my daughter was born. And one of the teachers was friends with Harry Holgate's wife, and Harry Holgate was the education minister. And one Friday, Pam must have asked Harry Holgate if they would let me teach longer, because this was the first year that we'd had a schools board class. One Friday night, 4 o'clock, I got a phone call from Noreen Miller, who was the personnel resource person in the education department, you know, way up there. And she said, about your approach to the minister. I said, I haven't talked to the minister. She said, pregnant women are not suited to be on a school campus. Go home and knit. My response was, I don't knit. I then went to Marion College, which is now Sacred Heart, where a friend was of ours was the principal. They had a grade 12 geography class that they needed to split, so I went and taught there for nothing to help them out until Co was born. On the day that I went into labour, the Friday afternoon, I was up at Ravenswood High School, climbing along the bookshelves, sorting out the book things. You know, this. Anyway, at the other end of my accouchement leave, I had a much better experience. Peter Brooker allowed me to take my 3-month-old baby back to school with me. We set up a corner in the staff room. My timetable was arranged so that I could have breaks at the right time to be able to breastfeed her. My dad happened to be a teacher's aide in the tech department, and he started work at 10 o'clock. So I would feed Co, go to school. Mum would come up to school with the baby and with Dad. Mum would look after Co during the day while I was teaching, and then I would bring them home at night. How many workplaces would be so progressive back in the late 70s, early 80s? That allowed me to continue my career, whereas my sister-in-law, who had her children at about the same time, had to resign and leave her career. I was so lucky. I was also lucky that I had Mum and Dad to support me. I realised that something happened to children when they went from grade 6 to grade 7 and 8. The lights went out. So I resigned my senior position, went into a primary school as a classroom teacher to see what was the difference, and I certainly saw the difference, the closeness, the consistency. Instead of having 10 people telling them children to rule up their books different ways, they had one person who nurtured them and got to know their parents. I really liked primary education because you had a freedom to do lots of things. We would have maths afternoons where we would make pizzas or sandwiches and divide them into fractions to teach fractions. You couldn't do that in a high school. You only had them for, a 3/4 of an hour. I had been in primary, secondary and senior secondary, and Alf Crawford wanted to set up a special ed program for teenagers at Launceston College. So he asked me if I would take it on, which I did. That started 13 years of teaching at Launceston College. I went from special education to a senior person in pastoral care and ended up as AP in administration, which was timetabling, staffing, budgets, finance, buildings, bricks and mortar. I went from touchy-feely to, really material in those 13 years. And that's where Jill says timetabling, staffing, that's where the jigsaws come in. After Launceston College, I won a dubious promotion to district office and was assistant to the superintendent. This period is the worst period of my life. I got my new position in 97, but in March, I separated from my then partner. In 98, again, March, I was abducted at gunpoint in Devonport. Later on that year, the Education Department abolished the district office, and so my job disappeared. So, trying to recover from an abduction, which was fairly traumatic, and then trying to deal with losing my job, wasn't a good year. The one good thing in that year was that I had, prior to all this, booked a round-the-world trip. Spain to meet up with a cousin, London to see some theatre, QE2 from Southampton to New York, and I did it all by myself after the post-traumatic stress that I was suffering and still having counselling about. I was able to visit the Twin Towers, and I have a very distinctive memory of going up in the lift to floor 107, and then you walk across you walked across a foyer where there were shops and things to get into another lift that took you up to the roof. I can remember thinking as I walked across, wouldn't this be terrible if it ever fell down? And so that morning, when we all watched it on television, it just devastated me. I ended up back at Exeter Primary School, this time as the AP, did lots of wonderful things with parents and kids there, swapped Pokemon cards with kids to keep them out of trouble in the playground, developed play areas, planted lots of trees, set up a gold canteen. It was all my educational philosophies coming together. This is what I believed, and I wrote that in the cement path that the kids and the parents and I built around the back of the school. I think the last bit is perhaps the hardest thing to do. Step back and I will act. I retired from Exeter Primary School in 2006. What was I going to do with myself? Well, first of all, I was a member of Zonta International, which is a service organisation that works specifically for women. Under the umbrella of Zonta, I set up with some of the most prominent men in Launceston community, like Albert, the Launceston White Ribbon Committee, which of course is a campaign to prevent violence against women. Now, that is too narrow an idea of white ribbon. It's really about equity, social justice. It's not just about the broken bones and the murders. It's about all those things in our society, in our culture, that lead to those situations that women find themselves in. And there's a large population of women in this room today. And did you know that our age group is the fastest growing group of homeless people? Because of things like women, I didn't have superannuation. We were actively told not to have superannuation. Your husband will look after you in your old age. And that, and my commitment to Zonta and White Ribbon, is a whole talk in itself. I'm also a member of the Launceston Historical Society, and a couple of the other members, Kelly was supposed to be here but she isn't, with Marita Bargenhagen, we set up a primary history prize which runs and has run for the last 10 years, where we encourage young people to look into historical subjects and do historical research, a bit like I've just done for this talk. I'm also a member of the Children's Book Council of Australia. As soon as I retired, a friend who was a librarian said to me, "You ought to be a judge for the Book of the Year." I said, "Oh yeah, that sounds interesting." 400 books a year later, and some of them are picture books, but some of them were Isabel Carmody's, novels like this. Did that for 2 years, so that's 800 books. And you get to read them in about 6 months as the publishers nominate them. That was an experience. Just recently, a couple of weekends ago, I was a judge in the Lions Youth of the Year, public speaking. Those sorts of activities really give you faith that we do have a future, that there is a generation of very capable people coming up behind us. So, I'm in 2 book clubs, and half of one of my book clubs is here today. I love film, so I'm in the Film Society. I have 2 grandchildren, a 7-year-old and a 12-year-old, who keep me up to date with modern youth culture. Very important. As Jill said, I'm a jigsaw addict, and you can see why with the staffing and all that sort of stuff. But I'm also the family birthday cake maker. Malcolm, this is... Oh, it's there. It's not on it. Yeah, right. There. The series of birthday cakes that have been assembled in the last few years. I'm hoping that the 12-year-old has got past the birthday cake age now. Which reminds me that amongst all this, I once ran a cooking school at Bridge North. I had a big organic garden, and I was really into healthy cooking. And for some time I wrote recipes for the Examiner. I don't know how I did all this. I mustn't have slept at night. Okay. Did we achieve what my parents aimed for us? These are some of my brother's achievements. 2 history books on the North East. He won... This is not working. It's been really good. Anyway, Jeffrey won the inaugural Break-A-Day photography competition, was exhibited in the Wilderness Gallery. If you Google Jeff Jennings, you'll see his aerial photography, which is incredible. And he, as a teacher at Scottsdale High School, established... So it's not just me. He established the Mount Cameron Outdoor Education Centre. There. So, for me, because of all those organisations, it's got a mind of its own, but it's nearly the end. So, as Jill said, in 2020, I was presented with the City of Launceston Citizen Award. I was an Australia Day Ambassador, and I was a finalist in the Tasmanian Senior Australia the year in 1917. And I got a public education recognition from the Teachers' Union. So, are we worth the free passage out? That's for you to decide. Thank you.
Carol, I'd just like to say that when I was a little kid going to our Catholic church in a little town in South Australia, the priest there one Sunday advocated that we take up collections of £10 to send back a pom.
Yes, there was a lot of that around. I was fortunate. I don't think I had very much prejudice or, you know, the whinging pom. That seems to have disappeared from our vocabulary nowadays, thank goodness. Yeah. Hopefully Jeffrey and I sort of earned the right to be Australian. Yes?
Yes, two things. Firstly, was that your mother pumping petrol at the service?
Yes. Yes.
The other one, I'd sort of like pay tribute to your brother. Amongst those other publications, he and the kids at the Scottsdale High School produced two very good videotapes at the time of the history of the Scottsdale and the old Ringarooma municipalities. They're brilliant.
Yes, and he did a lot of research gathering old photographs, which the children made into calendars for several years in a row. He's done some. I think he's probably done more than I have. Thank you for your time and listening. I hope I didn't bore you, but thank you, Jill, for asking me to do this, because it made me go back and think about my life and realise, yes, it wasn't too bad after all. I'm glad they came to Australia. Thank you.
Well, Carol, on behalf of all of us here today and the friends of the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery, I'd like to thank you so much for your talk today. You can understand my enthusiasm for our project, Our People, Their Stories. The personal stories bring history alive, and you certainly have done that today, and we really appreciate the effort you've done to craft what has been such an interesting talk. Reaching back to her family history not only gave us an insight in where her ambition and determination to succeed may have come from, but also gave us insights into what the experiences were of people post-war and why they were so keen to find new opportunities. Carol also gave us insights into her passion for teaching, her exploration of new methods, and the challenges of women that were trying to apply a career in those days of great change. We can see why Carol has been recognised by our community, and we're delighted to have a record of her story in our oral history project, which will go into the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery oral history collections. Thank you so very much, Carol. The next lecture will take place on Wednesday the 28th of May, and we're delighted to have Margaret Robertson here today. She's going to be our next speaker. A retired academic, she's the emeritus professor, is an emeritus professor at La Trobe University and a geographer. Her story, An Islander Comes Home, a sense of belonging, I think will be a very interesting experience for us all. So I hope you can all come and join us then. And until next month, thank you for coming, and we'll see you again soon.